I want to address this comment right here. Aaron says, "That's what all the unbelieving say, Michelle. You shouldn't be teaching or preaching, but yet here you are. You are a disobedient and quarrelsome woman as spoken of in Scripture, and you bring shame upon the church, aka body." Well, Aaron, I decided to do a video so that I can bring context of Scripture and also share an amazing testimony that has come out of my obedient life to God and the call that He has put on my life. And I want to say that the same Bible that you use to silence women is the same Bible that also shows women teaching and prophesying and leading. And the same Paul who wrote those letters is the same Paul that has affirmed women praying and prophesying in the assembly. And we read that Paul mentions Priscilla as a primary teacher who was directly involved in correcting and instructing a well-educated man who was also known as a preacher. We also read that Paul entrusted Phoebe with delivering the epistle to the Romans, a task that would involve having to explain it. We also read that Paul called Junia well known among the apostles and recognizes her significant ministry. Paul recognized women as fellow laborers of the gospel and commands the church to help these women who have labored side by side with him, not merely in service roles, but in the proclamation of the gospel. So I've given you several times all the scriptures, and scripture does not contradict itself. And you can't just disregard all of these scriptures and just hang on one, because out of that comes a false doctrine. You also go on to say that I am a disobedient and quarrelsome woman, but biblical obedience means submitting to the Spirit of God and the Word. The Great Commission in Matthew 28:19 and 20 is given to all believers, both male and female. And the outpouring of the Spirit in Acts 2:17-18 specifically says, "Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy." So this was given to all believers. This is not about woman versus man or man versus woman, Aaron. It's about God's calling versus man's opinion. And I will say that my husband would beg to differ with you, because he is one of the greatest testimonies that has come out of my life and obedience to God. It bears the fruit of my obedience to God's call in my life, not the fruit of quarrelsomeness. My life, my marriage, and my ministry are submitted to the Lord. And what is so glorious and an amazing testimony is that even in my disobedience to the Lord 20 years ago and marrying unequally yoked, I realized I needed to stop living life my own way and truly follow Christ. And that is when spiritual blessings began to pour into my life and into my marriage and into my family. And even facing a not so good marriage because of my disobedience, God gave me the strength and courage to stick it out and to remain a loyal, submissive wife to my husband, especially during some pretty hard and trying times. That is the fruit that God produces when we obey Him. Your man-made restrictions would have prevented all of that. Me being a witness to my husband and even teaching him and all my children and their spouses. They come to me still, even as adults, for guidance and for prayer. So when God calls a woman, opposing them is not opposing their gender, it's opposing Him. And you go on to say that I bring shame upon the church body. But shame is not brought on by obeying God's calling. And you know, Paul warns against quenching the Spirit and despising prophecy. If God appoints someone to speak His truth and others attempt to silence them, it is they, not the obedient servant, who oppose His work. If my words are Scripture saturated and Christ exalting, then I am in obedience to Him, and no man has the authority to overrule God's calling. I answer to the judgment seat of Christ, not the court of your opinion. So I would just be very careful to evaluate and examine your heart, because when you exalt yourself above women who God has clearly called and empowered, you're not just exalting yourself above them, you're exalting yourself above God. The Lord Himself chose women to judge nations, to proclaim Christ, to prophesy, and to teach. To oppose what God has ordained is to set yourself against Him. This is exactly why we can never hang on one scripture alone. We need the full counsel of God, and we need to study in depth the context of all scripture. This is how we rightly divide the word of truth. So I will keep following Christ as His disciple and obey the one who called me. And maybe you can take that up with Him at the judgment seat.